Today on the It Is Written program, Take the Risk with Dr. Ben Carson. You are not going to want to miss our conversation. We will be back in just a moment.
It has stood the test of time. God's book, the Bible, still relevant in today's complex world. It is written, sharing messages of hope around the world.
Joining me today on the It Is Written program is our special guest, Dr. Ben Carson. Dr. Carson, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be here on the It Is Written program.
It's my pleasure to be back again.
For the benefit of some of our viewers that may be just tuning in, tell us a little bit about who is Dr. Ben Carson?
Well, first of all, I'm a director of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins, a professor in multiple disciplines, but I started out as a little kid in Detroit, growing up in a single-parent home, dire poverty, pathological temper, poor self-esteem, all the markers of failure. Certainly an at-risk young person. But, you know, there were a number of things that happened during my life which I think precluded the failure that one would have predicted. Not the least of which was my mother, who was one of 24 children, got married when she was 13, moved from rural Tennessee to Detroit with my father. She discovered after a couple of years that he was a bigamist, had another family. That obviously was very traumatic. We moved to Boston to live with her older sister and brother-in-law. Typical tenement, large multifamily dwellings, boarded up windows and doors, sirens, gangs, murders. Both of my older cousins were killed. Wow. It was that kind of environment. And she was working as a domestic, cleaning other people's houses. She didn't want to be on welfare because she had noticed that she never saw anybody go on welfare and come off of it. And she didn't want her life to be controlled in that way. After a couple of years, we were able to move back to Detroit, still in a multifamily dwelling with significant wildlife, but nevertheless,
significant wildlife.
she was independent. I was a horrendous student. I just didn't seem to understand anything, and you know, it was that time where the transition began to occur because, you know, my mother knew that she had to work low-paying jobs because she didn't have the advantage of an education. She saw me going down the same road, my brother going down the same road, and she prayed and asked God to give her the wisdom to know what to do to get her young sons to develop themselves intellectually so they could control their own lives. And God gave her the ideal of turning off the TV, letting us watch only 2 or 3 TV programs during the week, and with all that spare time, read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Library, submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. And she would put little check marks and underline and highlight and stuff. But, you know, it made a profound difference. And in the beginning, I thought it was horrible.
Yes, I can imagine.
I thought it was child abuse, but it didn't take long before, you know, I couldn't wait to get home and open those books because we lived in a pretty horrendous environment, but between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere, I could be anybody, I could do anything. I began to imagine myself, you know, creating new chemicals and discovering new galaxies and microcosms, and I began to know things that nobody else knew. And I went from the bottom of my class to the top of the class in a year and a half.
My goodness.
And, you know, it just tremendously changed my life. Of course, I then had a horrendous temper problem as well. And it was only through the grace of God that I was able to handle that problem and realize that, you know, temper and anger issues primarily surround people who are self-centered because they're always thinking about how does that impact me? Why is that person in my space? Why did they do that to hurt me? And once you learn to step outside of the center of the equation and to be able to look in from the outside, it's very difficult for people to make you angry. And you have a much better perspective. And fortunately, you know, I was able to gain that before I ended up in jail or reform school or the grave. So, and then, you know, from there I went on, had a very, very rapid career, and ended up as chief of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins by the time I was 33.
My goodness. You know, just before we sat down here, we were just talking off camera, and I asked you, and I'm going to ask you, do you ever sort of pinch yourself and say, wow, how did I get from, you know, inner city Detroit to the highest of the high here? And
I do sometimes, you know, particularly if I'm sitting at home and the Lord has blessed us with an extremely nice home with a lot of property, and I'm just observing, you know, the beauty of nature and all the things that have happened in my life, and I'm just extraordinarily thankful that God has allowed that to occur, and I do recognize that it is Him. You know, when I look at all these wonderful surgical procedures that I've been credited with, and I know that I'm not really all that smart and all that good, and I know that there's another force behind it, but what I have been smart enough to recognize is that He is there, and that I can go to Him, and that I can ask Him for wisdom. And, you know, as it says in the first chapter of James, if any of you lack wisdom, you know, ask of God, who giveth liberally and upbraideth not. And you just ask Him, and then you dedicate yourself to the seeking of knowledge, because the human brain is just such a phenomenal organ. You know, it remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard. It can process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second.
my goodness.
You know, there is nothing.
Even my brain can do that?
Even yours. And, you know,
wow.
You'd be amazed at what people can do with even half of a brain. You know, last week I did an operation called a hemispherectomy on a little girl from Texas. And, you know, when she recuperates from all that, you know, you'll be amazed at what she can do with even half of a brain.
With half a brain.
Absolutely.
My goodness. Wow. Just recently, you were awarded the highest civilian award in the United States.
Yes, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And, you know, when I think about my life, I really hadn't thought that I had had that much of an impact. But, you know, to listen to the people in our government, I guess maybe I have. And it's not just what's done in the operating room. But, of course, I spent a great deal of time dealing with educational issues and dealing with various social issues and trying to help the next generation to recognize not only the importance of intellectual development, but the importance of having a good moral base to what you do. And the recognition of the fact that, you know, tolerance also means that you accept people who believe in traditional values.
Yes.
You know, we've gotten to the point where political correctness is anybody who believes in traditional stuff. Yeah, get them out of here. You know, we want this fringe stuff. We want this. This is the great stuff.
Yes.
You know, and you know, the fact of the matter is, if you go back and you look at great societies, pinnacle societies of the world, who all thought that they were going to be there forever, what happened in each case? They became enamored of sports and entertainment, lifestyles of the rich and famous. They lost their moral compass, and they went right down the tubes. It's just like, you know, a formula. And, you know, I've said that, is there any reason at all that we can't learn from their mistakes?
Right.
Do we absolutely have to inexorably follow the same formula for disaster? And I don't believe we have to. And this is what I've been pushing and advocating to people. And it's a huge risk that our society faces right now as we begin to throw out all the values that made us into great people.
Wow. You're an accomplished author. I've had a chance to read your most recent book, take the risk. I have to tell you, the title caught me a little off guard, because like most people, I think I've been sort of been preconditioned in life
to be risk adverse.
That's right, to avoid risk. And here is Ben Carson, a man whom I respect, and you've been an inspiration to me and to my family and to millions of people around the world. He's telling me to take risk. Wow. What sort of was the impetus for you? What inspired you to...
Well, first of all, you have to recognize that almost any accomplishment in the history of the world has come at the hands of people who've taken risk. People who are willing to push the envelope. People who are willing to explore the unknown. Even if you go and you look in the Bible, you know, the people that are held up as the heroes, they're not the ones who were sitting in their tent under an olive tree. Right. You know, they were people who were going out there doing stuff. Right. And you know, the key thing about taking risk is learning. You know, and if something doesn't work out, learn from it, and then you're able to move further. And you know, what really got me thinking about writing this book was the case of the Bajani twins.
Yes, you tell the story in the book, at the beginning of the book, yes.
Right. Many people will probably remember this case because it had a lot of media attention. 29-year-old Iranian women joined at the head. Their dream was to be separated. And, you know, they looked all over the world. I remember when I was first contacted about the case, I talked to them about Chang and Ing Bunker, the original Siamese twins, who were born in Siam in the year 1811, and were the ones who made Barnum and Bailey famous, traveled all over the world. Siam, of course, is now called Thailand. But they lived until they were 63 years old, had 21 children.
21 children, wow.
But, so they were pretty creative fellows. But at any rate, it turns out that they didn't want to hear any about that. They wanted to be separated, and they finally found a team in Singapore that was willing to do it. And, you know, I felt obligated to go and help. And I was just so impressed when I met those young women. They were so bright. They had learned to speak English in only 7 months, if you can imagine that. They both had college degrees.
I mean, one was a journalism degree, was one a journalism, and one a law degree?
Well, they both had law degrees.
Both had law degrees.
Only one wanted one, but they both had them. You have to realize any degrees they had, they both had them.
Yes, that's right.
So, you know, they had a very thorough understanding of what it is they were up against. But they said something to me that really impressed me. They said, "Doctor, we would rather die than spend another day stuck together." And that struck me as very harsh. But then I started thinking about it. What if you were stuck 24/7 to the person in the world you liked the most, and you could never get away from them for even 1 second for anything?
Wow.
Can you imagine what that would be like? Particularly if you're a very intelligent individual. So wow. I began to understand, because, you know, we don't fault people who, say, have been put into a prison camp for the rest of their lives, who take extraordinary, you know, life-risking chances to escape, because we understand that. Sure. Well, they were in the same situation. Wow. And then I began to understand where they were coming from at that point. Well, you know, that operation did proceed. We were about 90% of the way finished. The operation took 53 hours. And people were starting to celebrate, and then things started to go awry. And of course, they did not survive. But you know, there were a lot of things that were learned from that, things that we did not know before. And those things will be useful in the future. And you know, we have to always recognize that, you know, knowledge frequently comes at a price. You know, Thomas Edison said he knew 999 ways that a light bulb did not work.
Did not work, right.
You know, many of us are familiar with the cleaning formula 409. Why do they call it that? The first 408 didn't work, you know? But, you know, you just put these things into perspective and you learn from them. Walter Dandy, the great neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins many decades ago, was the first one to do operations on the posterior fossa, the back part of the brain. No one thought it could be done. First 13 patients all died. Now, can you imagine how devastating that was? And I can't even imagine what he said to the 14th patient when they said how the other 13 do. You know, but the fact of the matter is, we now are able to do that operation routinely and safely.
My
I did
goodness.
one last week. And so, you know, we just have to put all these things in perspective and recognize that we will never make progress unless we're willing to take risks. But we have to take them in an appropriate fashion.
Right.
Because, you know, there's a large group of people who never get anywhere because they're afraid to take a risk. There's another group of people who never get anywhere because they take too many of the wrong risks. They're always getting knocked back into the pond. So that's where this tremendous brain comes in, where you are able to analyze
And you
appropriate
and
risk.
choose it. Now, you make reference to 8 truths about risk. I think it's 8 truths? Or myths, or is that what you call them? Truths about risk? One of them being that, we all face risk, right? Or something. Is that?
I do make reference to the fact that we cannot go through a single day in our lives without taking risks, but sometimes we don't look at them in an appropriate fashion. For instance, you look at all the people who are afraid to fly, and yet, you know, the risk of dying in an airplane crash is infinitesimally small. Those same people get in their car and they drive all over the place, not recognizing that 1 in every 25 drivers that they encounter is drunk, and that their chances of being killed or injured in an automobile are many times higher than the risk of flying. So we begin to distort these things. We listen to the media.
So I was going to ask, what do you think contributes to that distortion then of these?
Well, a lot of it is hype. There's recently the scare about tomatoes and, you know, the salmonella in tomatoes. You know, there may be a few people who get affected by that, but, you know, they're probably engaging in much riskier activities than that on a daily basis. So the reason that I give so many examples in the book is just to bring it into perspective for people what the real risks are that you are facing in life. And one of the things that is important to do is ask yourself some important questions. Like, what's the best thing that happens if I do this? What's the worst thing that happens if I do this? What's the best thing that happens if I don't do it? What's the worst thing that happens if I don't do it? And by asking those 4 simple questions, you can greatly clarify a lot of the risks that come into your life. This is particularly important for young people.
Yes.
And, you know, I give an example in the book of a young honor student who went out celebrating with some of his friends, and they were riding in a convertible, and they, you know, had a gun, and they said, just shoot the gun up in the air, we're celebrating. And someone ended up being shot and killed in that celebratory phase. And of course, he ended up in an enormous amount of trouble when he had such a promising life in front of him. What if he had just asked those 4 questions? He wouldn't have even considered it. And just getting people to stop and to think before they move makes a big difference. And you can do it, and you can teach somebody to do that at an early age, and it makes a big difference.
So this would be a learned behavior.
Yes.
Ideally taught at an early through modeling. Is there a particular formula?
Well, you can learn it at any age. You know, I talk about a group of marine biologists in the book who heard me talking about this on National Public Radio. And they had an ecological problem they were trying to solve with sharks and seals. And you know, they were back and forth, and they applied those 4 questions. And then they talked about what the answers were for each of those questions. That made it very simple for them to decide what to do, and they solved the problem. And they had contacted me to ask if they might acknowledge me in the scientific paper they were writing, because this is how they had solved the problem. But, you know, it works in virtually any setting. And it's really logic. And so many people lead their lives by reacting rather than by thinking. And really, when you think about it, why do we have these incredibly sophisticated brains with these big frontal lobes? Because we're the only creatures that God made with the ability to extract information from the past and the present and to project it into a plan for the future. So we don't have to react. You know, animals, you know, they just, well, whatever's happening, they react to it.
Right.
Why is it that so many people act like animals? Why do they just react to what's going on rather than to plan and strategize? We have the ability to figure out where we want to be a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and to begin to organize things in a way in order to accomplish those goals. And when we don't do that, we place ourselves in tremendous jeopardy because we place ourselves in a situation where we can only react.
We live in such a fast-paced society. It almost seems like we're in such a hurry to get things done that we don't spend enough time thinking about how to. I would agree that we are reactive. We're definitely not strategic. In most cases, we don't develop a rationale for why we're going to act this way. We've just been so conditioned by society.
And in many cases, we actually know that there's a problem coming, and we still don't react to it. I mean, how long have we known, for instance, that energy was going to be an issue?
Yes.
And for decades, you know, people saying, you know, we're going to be in a problem one day, and people are going to really start putting the screws to it. And okay, so yeah, okay, now what's the score?
Right.
You know, and you know, we have to, even as a society, learn how to plan and to strategize and to react to risk and to ask ourselves those questions and to actually do something about it. You know, that's called wisdom.
That is some credible stuff. It's just not an issue of IQ, though, right?
No, it's not an issue of IQ. Well, first of all, recognize that anybody with an average brain is a genius because of what the human brain is capable of doing.
So the potential is there.
The potential is there if you have an average brain. You know, a lot of people say, for instance, I can't do algebra, trigonometry, calculus, you know, that's just beyond me. Totally false. You know, most people don't think reading is difficult. Why? Because they know all 26 letters of the alphabet. What if they only knew 21? It'd be very difficult to read. And pretty soon they'd be saying, well, you know, the reading's not for me, that's for somebody, you know, who's really much more superior. Well, math, science are exactly the same way. You fill in the blocks, all of a sudden it becomes very logical, very intelligible. But if you miss those things and then you keep going up to the next level, pretty soon it becomes a bunch of mumble jumble. And it's one of the real issues, and I talk about it in the book, one of the tremendous risks that are faced, you know, in the Western world right now, because we are not really pushing the science and the technology. You know, if you buy a new computer and you need support, you're going to end up talking to somebody in India or South Korea or China. You know, and recognizing that years ago when we were in the agricultural age, you know, we could produce more corn, wheat, and barley than anybody. When we were in the industrial age, more washing machines and cars than anybody. But now we're in the information age. We're in the technological age. No longer can 1% of the population pull the other 99% along. We're going to have to change that equation, or simply be willing to relinquish our position in the world.
Wow.
And it is, and again, if we react to it the way we have to all the other things, and that is to just say, yeah, it's a problem, what's the score? Then, you know, the handwriting's on the wall.
I heard someone once say, if you always do what you've always done, you're always going to get
what you've always gotten. You're right.
Dr. Carson, we didn't even get to, there's a part here I wanted to talk to you about where you make reference to faith is a risk. And if you'd be gracious enough to accept our invitation to come back, I would love to talk about faith and your faith. And you know, you're someone that is pretty upfront about it, his faith.
I would love to come back and talk about that.
Well, thank you. I think that's a cliffhanger. I think we've just got a cliffhanger for folks to come back. We are going to end our program with prayer.
Yes.
Father in heaven, thank you so much for the awesome privilege we had of having Dr. Carson on the program and his wise counsel. And we think of each and every viewer that is watching right now. Father, may they take these lessons to heart, and may you give us the wisdom that we need in order to live life and to live it wisely and more abundantly. Be with each and every viewer now and forevermore, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, Dr. Carson, thank you again for being on the program.
Absolutely.
Maybe some parting words for our viewers.
Well, my parting words would involve, what do you really want in your life? What do you want to accomplish? Are you complacent and are you happy just to be doing what you're doing? Or do you think there's potentially more? And if you think there's more, why not use that tremendous brain that God gave you in order not only to envision it, but to make it happen? Not only for yourself, but for those people around you. Because real success involves lifting up those who are around you and making your environment a better place than it was before you got there.
Well, thank you, and I want you to know you have made our program a better program by you being here.
Thank you.
Dr. Carson has accepted our invitation to be back next week. I hope you will join us also. We will be here, same time, same station. Until then, remember, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God.